Before we begin this overview of 2 Corinthians 9, we're up to that chapter, I wanted to just give you a little word about this book that's coming out this fall, InterVarsity Press. And it's this is the final title. We finally settled on it after many iterations. Recalibrate Your Life is the official title of the book, Navigating Transitions with Purpose and Hope. And the reason why we're doing it in this way, transitions, is because it's not just when you're retiring that you're asking these questions, but you should be asking these questions throughout the course of your life, you see. So what does that look like? So we have a series where we go, what gives perspective, what gives meaning to life, leaving a godly legacy, seeing death as a portal, treasuring God and people, moving from career to calling, and developing a better vision of retirement as well. But then what gives direction is universal purpose and is unique purpose, and then stewardship issues of time, talent, treasure, truth, and relationships, and living so that the best is yet to come. And what's also interesting about this book is that there's a hands-on toolkit for spirit-led recalibration. So part B is a very important part of it because it gives you 20 particular things that you can use on this thing. If you can find it here. Yeah, there's a whole array of tools, and one of them that I'm going to turn into a kind of a separate standalone booklet is a guide to a recalibration retreat, which would be a great thing for you to do on an annual basis. And we're going to turn it into a little booklet where it becomes a journal. And so what would you do if you did a one-day or half-day retreat and you plan it on your calendar like any other appointment as far in advance as possible? You know what'll happen, of course. When you get close to it, you'll say, hey, I got a free day. And then you won't do the appointment. But you need to take that seriously because it could very well be the most important day of your year. Because it'll cause you to see things about yourself that you will otherwise not see. Very few men do this sort of a thing. So it has a suggested retreat schedule. Because if you're going to do something like this, it might be good to know what you're supposed to do. And this kind of takes you by the hand and gives you the backward look. And so you get a perspective on the backward look where you review and synthesize and summarize. Then there's the upward look where you spend time connecting with God and this being and rather than just doing. And also another component here with lots of descriptions, the inward look and then the forward look. And so it just gives you a way of kind of processing this. It's a pretty simple tool, but it's a very powerful thing. So I'm looking forward to this thing coming out. It'll be InterVarsity Press this fall. So we'll see what that means this fall. I never know, out of my hands. Scripture guide for transitions as well. That can be very helpful and things of this nature. So we have a lot of different things, finding your identity in Christ, various tools here, and the 4 fundamental questions of life that we have to ask. And of course, one of those fundamental questions, and they relate to the morning affirmations, is who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Pretty obvious questions, aren't they? Most people don't ask them. They very rarely think them through. But the who am I really has to do with the question of identity. And the why am I here, your purpose, and where am I going is going to be related to your hope. So this is a huge theme for people. And so I just wanted to call your attention to that before we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. So it's something we're going to be making available. I'll keep you posted on that. Now, what we do is go alternate Old and New Testament, and in the book of the 2 Corinthians, which we're up to in the New Testament, we looked at last time, a couple weeks ago, at chapter 8. And it has to do with generosity. It has to do with the concept of giving, of being generous. And the church in Macedonia, the churches of Macedonia, have actually been following what he was doing with the Corinthians. And so looking at that material there, we looked at something along this line here. So in chapter 8, we explored this whole idea of a number of components, and we're going to be looking more at this today, some principles, New Testament principles of giving. which are more radical than one might suppose. It's not the tithe, it's a new kind of a thing altogether. And so when we look at chapter 9, we'll be zooming in on this concept here. And so Paul appeals to the Corinthians, having been speaking about the nature of this, and where he spoke about the fact that these people were actually giving this. They first gave themselves and also to the Lord and us by the will of God. But he describes that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. According to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging with much urging for the favor of participation. This is an actual privilege to be able to give in this way. Grace giving has to do with this concept. And so they gave themselves to the Lord and then us by the will of God. And so he speaks about this whole process here. And then picking up in chapter 9, we'll look at some certain principles here. He says it's superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. He's now speaking to the Corinthians in this second epistle. But when he was first with them in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, I want you to notice something there that is related to this, because in chapter 16, he gave instructions. So before he went to the churches of Macedonia, he gave instructions to the Corinthians for the collection of the saints. As I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections may be made when I come. What he's saying here is that he was actually encouraging the church to actually invest in and support people who were suffering, believers who were suffering, especially in the area of Israel, where there was some opposition and affliction. And so these were Jewish believers, and he's telling these Gentiles that you actually owe it to them, because it was salvation is of the Jews, and ultimately then to realize that you are sharing in their spiritual things, but now you can also participate in their material things. And so he describes then that that's an opportunity, a privilege for them to be involved in. So when he was then in the third missionary journey, then he wrote 1 Corinthians when he was in Ephesus, and then ultimately he visits Macedonia and goes down to Corinth again, and then he goes back in the second missionary journey, and the ideas are going to go back to Israel, and that's where he's going to carry this offering that's going to be brought to support these people. So this is his desire for the church. He says, concerning the collection, then he's directed them. Now, he suggests that he's giving the idea, one of the principles then is there's a consistency involved here. And in this instance, on the first day of the week, well, that's when they gathered. So that the church typically would gather at that period on those days. It's an amazing thought that the church, actually, which began really in Israel, moved from Sabbath on Saturday to Sunday because of the resurrection. So it was a radical change for them to make. And so he's telling them then to put aside as he may prosper, so that no collections may come. And this has to do with the idea of a proportionate giving as well. So that he says, when I come to you after I go through Macedonia, because I'm going to go through them, perhaps I'll stay with you or even spend the winter. So he says, I don't want to see you now just in passing. He wants to remain with them for some time as the Lord permits. But he tells them about his plans about going to Ephesus and so forth. And so going back then to our text in 2 Corinthians then, we're going to jump ahead to chapter 9 and pick up from where we left off. So this is the background. So he speaks about the fact that the Macedonians, that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. So first of all, in the church in Achaia, then he's speaking about that's where Corinth is. So if we take a quick look at this, then Corinth is in this area here, and further up is the Macedonians. And Macedonia especially the first city he would visit there would be Philippi. And then Thessalonica is another key city as well, and Berea. So when he first visited with the Corinthians and wrote to the Corinthians, they enthusiastically began to put money aside for this collection, or that's what they were going to be doing. He then told the churches later on when he went down through and went back to Corinth, he then told them that the Macedonians have really gotten on board with this. And so he's now using them as an encouragement for the Corinthians who haven't yet fulfilled what they were promising. So he starts off with the Corinth, and then the Macedonians pick up on this, and now he's using the Corinthians, he's using their zeal to encourage them to fulfill their promise. So he said, I've sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be brought to shame by this conference. So he's actually using that as a vehicle to encourage them to give, because you're the ones who inspired them. They followed through, but you have not. So it's kind of an interesting arrangement. I thought it was necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift. And he's referring, by the way, this is the way it worked with churches. Churches would take up collections, and the money would be used for both the purposes of evangelism and teaching, and as well as supporting the needs of the saints and the material needs as well, on the local level, and in this instance, beyond. So the churches then were seen really as the entities that would then support ministries in varying ways. So that, for example, the Philippians sent a gift more than once for Paul's needs, so that they were fundamentally collecting money, taking care of their own needs, but also the needs of those who are in the church. But then beyond that, investing in the propagation of the gospel and the teaching of the word. So this is, and then as well as in this unique situation, the assistance with people who were in dire straits in Israel. So this is he's wanting them then to do this, because he says, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And it makes complete sense, this whole idea of sowing and reaping, and what a person sows. And so we think about that consequence then, the back and forth of that. For example, it brings up to mind Galatians chapter 6, because again, you have this whole idea of sowing and reaping. And so do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one in this context now, he's speaking spiritually. The one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And so he says, do not let us lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. And I love this verse in verse 10. It's one for you to consider from time to time. So then while we have opportunity, while you have kairos, while you have God's time and his opportunities that are granted to you, and you don't know how long that'll be. So you need to treat each day as really as if it were your last. You don't know, you don't want to presume. But while you have opportunity, what does he tell us to do? To do good to all people, and especially to those of the household of faith. We are called to actually manifest the life of Christ in us and through us, because of the faith that will produce good works as a consequence of this. And so the sowing and reaping principle is very much of a theme in his teachings. So going back to 2 Corinthians 9 again, he's now telling them then that this sowing and reaping, each one must do just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So the idea of giving is actually to be regarded as a privilege, as a grace, as an opportunity that you can have. So the concept then is that a person would be pleased and privileged to be able to do this, and to be able to be used by the Spirit of God as the Spirit of God leads, for us to take our material resources, and then transmit them and transfer them into spiritual assets in building into the other people. God loves a cheerful giver. And he's able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. And so this is a motif that we see as well in the Hebrew Bible, and the whole idea of sowing and reaping. Of course, in an agricultural community, that would make a great deal of sense to them. And he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. And so the idea is that as you continue to do this, God will make provision so that you'll be able to multiply what he's given you, and it'll actually have an effect on others. This is a spiritual investment. And so when you're thinking about a good investment, what returns do you get on an investment? You see, the ROI on this thing is boundless because it goes forever. You see, you're dealing with a return on investment that will last, not just something for material gain, gaining some measure of success on a business deal. But in this context, he's saying that you are to take what God provides for you and anything that as he gives it to you proportionately and so forth, and you're to invest this and transmute then the currency of this world into the currency of heaven. And what is the currency of heaven? What is the currency of heaven? And the word is relationships. That's what the currency of heaven is. So that you are now able to take that which is passing away and to invest that by enhancing relationships, and you're dealing with eternal beings. And that is a very wise investment indeed from an eternal perspective. It always comes down, doesn't it, to your perspective, whether you have a temporal or an eternal perspective. Yes, Leonard.
Passage the source for the prosperity gospel that we...
Some people misuse this. I'm glad you brought that up. Leonard's asking, is this passage the source for the prosperity gospel? I have seen this text used in that way. I've seen it called seed faith giving and so forth, and that sort of notion. And the idea is if you give, you'll get more. And so the idea is that the more you give, the more you get. And so and it's almost like presumably a guarantee, as if we've got now God in a way that we can control him. Well, you said this, and so, or another manifestation of this, the word faith movement, they're cognate. It's basically confess and possess is the idea. You see, if you confess it, then you possess it. Blab it and grab it. That's another way. Blab it and grab it. There's another variation of that. But there's all this whole, what's that?
Name it.
Yeah, name it, claim it, and frame it. It's even a third. Frame it. Yeah. It's crazy stuff. Why do people like that? Because you see, it goes to them, and so they're really giving so that they can get more. Is almost the notion. Rather, it's a kind of a distortion of the whole principle that's involved here. That as God provides for you, then you are privileged, and that's why you do it cheerfully. That you are honored and privileged to actually have an effect that will actually resonate into eternity. Now, I do believe that you can't outgive God, by which I mean, if you decide to increase the amount that you're giving, I think that God is going to, in all things being equal, very likely increase or supply you so that you can take the risk on giving. You see the concept? Just as you can't out-time God. If you spent more time in intimacy with him, I think it would energize your activity. You see, so there's a risk spending time, your great assets of time and money. And how can you take those things and to transmute them into another thing? So when you spend time with God, intimacy animates and energizes activity. When you also then choose to give generously, then as you do so, God can provide for that. But it's not so that it comes to you, but rather it's a privilege of participation. And that's what it comes down. But this is often distorted, isn't it? It just goes down to the material. And so it becomes pretty ugly in many respects then, where people have this notion then of prosperity gospel, which doesn't play very well in third world countries, by the way. But at any rate, the idea of the prosperity gospel is a thin notion, and really it's just a thin veneer of basically self-aggrandizement, and especially when it's associated with some kind of a claim that if you say this and pray this, then it's yours, as if God were some kind of a cosmic vending machine. If I put the right money in there, I push the right buttons, I should get this outcome. It's sympathetic magic, and it's not biblical at all. So these, as you know, scriptures can be distorted and will be, but always see them. A text without a context is a pretext. So always see what it's about and what it's really saying. Get the big picture here, and don't just take one and isolate it. At any rate, it's going to increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality. And so he's speaking here about through us, which through us is producing thanksgiving for God, to God. And he amplifies what he means by that. He says the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but then he says it's overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. So in this sense, again, you're dealing with the currency of heaven, thanksgiving, enhanced relationships, and so forth. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. And then he concludes, thanks be to God for this, his indescribable gift, before he now goes to another section in the material. Remember, again, the chapters are not there, so he really is, but this is the conclusion of this concept here. So I want to unpack that a little bit for you by looking at this in some other ways. And so I have some resources along this line. And one of those resources that I have is this whole idea of leveraging temporal wealth for eternal gain. And so I want to just make a few comments about this. I'm working on a book with Russ Crossan right now, Leverage, transmuting the assets of this world into the assets of the next, essentially. But so the idea of how does one, what are the biblical principles? And then he is with Ron Blue Trust, and so he's kind of like an expert on these areas of application. So it's principles and practice, and I haven't seen that done before, but that's what we're kind of combining that together. But so this is a kind of a component that was done that we integrated in that book. But there are various processes, and one of them is prayerful reflection and preparation. And I invite people to reflect. This isn't from the book, this is an outline that I used before the book, but reflect on biblical passages in the temporal versus the eternal, because at the end of the day, that's what we're really talking about. You're taking those things which are passing away, and that's why Jesus says, make friends for yourself by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, that's when you die, they will be there to receive you into the eternal dwelling, so that you take the time, talent, and assets, and time, talent, and treasure that are just with you for just a few years, a very brief sojourn, and you transmute them into the currency of heaven. And what is that? Relationships. But the other thing that goes on forever, besides people, is the Word of God. So now you're taking two things that will endure forever. The two things in this world that will go on forever is the Word of God and people. Now what you're doing is you're taking those things which are passing away, your time, very ephemeral, your talent, this is again something that you have while you're alive, and then your treasure, and you're transmuting that into building truth into people. You see what you're doing? You're taking the temporal, and now you're actually using those resources, your time, talent, treasure, to actually build eternal truth into eternal beings, which is, in my mind, a very good leverage indeed. It's a very wise thing to do. And so this whole idea of the temporal versus the eternal makes all the difference. Now, there's been a misuse of Malachi 3:10, I fear, because in many cases It talks about bringing the whole tithe to the storehouse. And so often the assumption then is that it's a 10% thing, and this is what we're mandated to do in the New Testament. But you don't really see that. After the Gospels then, when you get into the New Covenant, the time of the New Covenant, the principles of the tithing are not seen, but rather something more radical than that. And by the way, if you were to play that game, the 10% tithe, it's more radical than you would have thought even there in the Hebrew Bible, because there turned out to be 3 tithes, as you may know. There were 2 annual tithes, and one of those annual tithes was for the priests and so forth, and another was for the widows and the orphans and so forth. So you have these tithes that were done, and one tithe then was to support the ministries that were going on, the spiritual things, but another was where they were to take 10% of their wealth, and they were to go up to Jerusalem, and they were to spend a couple weeks there and have a party. Is what they would do, actually. It's an amazing thought. When they would actually go to Jerusalem, that they would spend it on this concept. It's remarkable. So they would go up to Jerusalem then, and they would actually take their money, and they would just celebrate before their Lord together. Now that's an interesting thought. Why would they do that? Well, in one way, God hates stinginess and basically a cheap mindset here, and he loves extravagance and generosity. So one of the ways in which he forces them to be dependent upon him is for them to invest part of that in that respect. So in one sense, they would give to this one tithe, but there was another tithe that most people don't know much about, that they would use in celebration and before the Lord their God in that special time together. And they could spend it on whatever their hearts desired and do that. So in one way then, that made them more dependent upon God, not less. Now, there's a third tithe that was a triannual tithe. So if you add those 3 together, you're really getting about 23.5%, you see, that they were actually giving in the tithe, you see. But then I've come up with a 4th tithe. And what I mean by that, quote tithe, is a passive tithe. Because it turns out they were commanded in the law that they were not to actually beat their fruit trees more than once. See, when they harvested, just one time. Why? Because when more came up, it was for the alien, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, you see. And that was an incredible provision in that way. Radical concept, isn't it? Moreover, not only were they not to over-harvest, but also they were commanded not to actually go to the edge when they're on their fields then. Not to go to the edge of it, but to leave that for those people as well. So a portion of that edge would not be actually used by them. And when you put those things together, and then the grapes the same way, with the grapes only one time. So you know there's going to be more. What's going on here? There's a passive mindset here where passively these people are actually supporting and sustaining the needs of people who would otherwise be destitute and desperate. Because, as you know, a widow really didn't have many options in that culture at all. And the alien, the orphan, and the sojourner. So it's an incredible thing that was hardwired into the law itself that would be designed to do that. So I began to think about this. If you're not to go to the edge of your fields, if you're not to actually do your fruit trees twice and your grapes twice, what do you work that out to be? I'm going to estimate they're losing about 10% of their productivity. So that's why I call that a 4th tithe, a passive tithe. I'll let you process that. So if you're going to play the tithing game, it's more radical than you suppose. But that said, the New Testament's even more radical than that because of the principle of one of the things about stewardship, of course, is that this principle that God owns everything. And so the idea of stewardship then as one who, where we see that God is the one who, you don't owe anything. The stewardship of all of our resources. So a kingdom mind set in which personally beneficial is trumped by what's beneficial to others. So then a biblical investment philosophy and transmuting the currency of the temporal, again, time, talent, and treasure, into the currency of eternal truth and people, what I've just mentioned here. So the hidden impact of your life, this phrase, incalculably diffusive, which I pick up from the end of Middlemarch, about a description of Dorothea Brooke, whose life was extraordinary in the way it had an impact on people, though it was not visible in many ways, but it was still there. And most of your impact, by the way, is hidden. You won't know your impact on other people. So as you invest in people, whether in a material way or in a relational way, whatever you do for people, you don't know what impact that's going to have. It can multiply and it can reverberate. And so the effect of your being on others that know you can be incalculably diffusive. It diffuses, but you can't quantify it, you see. Have you ever had a time, though, perhaps when somebody has told you, you may not know this, but when you said this or did this, this had a this really affected me? And sometimes you may hear about something you did later on. And I have found that sometimes occurring, and usually that occurs when I need encouragement, you see. And so often God will reveal some of your hidden impact, even in this life. But He doesn't want you to see the fullness of your impact, or you'd live for the results, you see. And you just be doing one after another. And then, therefore, you have present tense your reward. Don't count on anything in the future. But rather, He calls us to the ambiguity of hidden impact, just as I say that true fame is not in cognition, but in reception, by which I mean, it's not how many people know you, your name, or any of that. That doesn't define you. What really defines you is how many people have received something from you, that your spirit, your soul has touched their lives, you see, and there's a reception that you can't define. And that's what's incalculably diffusive. One thing you did for this person changed their life, and then that changed another person. Karen just got a thing like that just the other day. An email from this woman that I had totally forgotten when we were living in Dallas Seminary in 68 to 72. This was about 1971, I think. There was this couple one of the many that we ministered to, and I still remember us meeting with them. And she described how she called Karen once and got counsel from her that radically changed her whole perspective on things. It was an amazing thing. She was very specific in the way it did that. And she says, ever since then, that has marked my life permanently. Now, Karen doesn't even remember the call. In fact, she's hard-pressed to remember the person. That was a long time ago. But you get my point. And it was really important for her to hear that. Because you see, you do not know your impact, the way you touch people. But it can be impressive, not before men, but pleasing to God. Now, you can't impress God, but you can please Him. Impossible to impress, easy to please, though. And so the concept then is that you can have incalculably diffusive impact, and an act of kindness or service or whatever it happens to be in this life cannot really be measured. So it's not in cognition, but it's in reception, the hidden impact of your life. But it does take, and I mentioned as well, this is a different discussion. I talk about the difference between giving wealth with a warm hand and a cold hand, which is always interesting. That's another discussion. Many people give it away after they die, and my thinking is, if you're giving while you're living, then you're knowing where it's going. You see, so the idea then. And the supposition is that, well, if I put it in a fund, then it's going to build interest and so forth. But how do you know that if it was used right then and there, it would not have had an incalculably diffusive impact, which would transcend even if it grew 500 times? You see, you cannot measure that. You cannot measure the metrics of the kingdom are not measured in nickels and noses. The metrics, it's not attendance, buildings, and cash, ABC. And it's not, or another way of putting 3 Bs. You've heard me say this metric. Buildings, budgets, and body count. You cannot quantify the kingdom of God in those metrics. Earthbound metrics won't do. But we want to always try to do it because we so love the visible that it's difficult for us to treasure the unseen. But it takes a greater risk to give with a warm hand while you're still alive. So there are certain principles, and one of those principles comes from this text we've been looking at, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and 1 Corinthians 16. So in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, the two principles that are there, and in 1 Corinthians 16, proportionate and sacrificial. So the idea of being proportionate, because they gave beyond their need. So what would that look like? Well, start with the idea of proportionate giving. When we think about what that looks like in terms of the proportionate giving, we look at this concept and see that you have a certain amount of wealth, and so if you have been given X amount of dollars, and so you have, let's suppose a person then has an income where he's making $100K, let's say, and then he decides he wants to give a certain away. What's my percentage of the giving then? And so if I give the same percentage away, if suddenly for one reason or another he makes 300, but now he's got to give 3 times that amount of money away. He says, well, I don't know if I can afford to give that much money. It's the dumbest thing in the world. It's amazing how dumb people can be who are otherwise smart, because they're basing it not on the proportionate, but in the actual amount. The very fact is, if you've got 3 times more, you can give a good deal more away, if you get the concept here. And so what really proportionate given means, the more you have, the more the percentage should go up. You see the concept there? Because so that there are people who have been giving 90%, and it still doesn't hurt them that much because they make that much. But my point is, proportionate giving, what's fascinating here is that, typically speaking, the more a person makes, the less percentage they give. That's actually what happens. The poor give a higher percentage than do the wealthy. Why is that? Something's wrong with this picture. Because they're looking at the money then on terms of the absolute dollars rather than the proportionality. It's nutty that they don't think about that. My view is that as God, and this is a conviction between you and God now. What's hard about this is we're not told how much we're to give. There are principles, and sacrificial, proportionate, cheerful, consistent are those principles. So how do I define that? Well, when he says they gave according to their provision and even more, then proportionate giving would seem to me then to be something that you could bump it up as you continue to go, and the more you get, the more you give. And so now that's a principle that can amplify what you're up to, and it can have a profound impact. Now, what that looks like, though, is a question that you have to determine. You see, whether you decide that it ought to bump it up to this, it's a conviction between yourself and God. Remember, biblical conviction is a thought-out resolution between yourself and God that governs your behavior. So if you think about a biblical conviction, then I can't say that you should give this amount of money away, but it should, if it's proportionate, it should be increasing the more you make. Is that making sense to you? I hope so. So it may be that you come to the point where you're giving 30% away, maybe 40, maybe 50, maybe 60, maybe 70. And my view is that God, as you take that risk and continue to do it proportionately, that can make an enormous difference. And that's where the seed concept comes in, and you are given the opportunity then to have the privilege of giving more in this concept. So test me in this way and see if I will not provide for you. And then, but the other part that's very difficult then is the sacrificial, because sacrificial giving is very difficult to understand. What does that look like? How would you define sacrificial if a person has a net worth of 100 million? You see? Now think about this process for a moment when you think about sacrificial. You can only eat so well. You can only vacation so well. There's only so much. You can only luxuriate to so much. You can only dress so well. You can only drive so well. You see where and with houses. And so there comes a point where after that, the money, the amount of money becomes symbolic rather than actual, if you know what I'm saying there. Because the difference in your lifestyle between a second 100 million and a first 100 million is not going to make won't improve your lifestyle as such, if you know what I'm saying. It probably make life more complicated for you. But the point is that what does that look like? How much is enough is the question you have to ask. And this is a tough question. Very few men ask what that top level is. Very few people ask this level of ceiling. And so what I mean by this is that when you're looking at this level here, and you reach, if you came to a point where there would be a ceiling, and this is it, and anything beyond that is going to be given away. That'd be an interesting thing, wouldn't it? So this would be 100% then. But the concept then is that you're always going to be giving something away. There's always going to be something going down. But as this thing goes up, then you might reach it up to a higher percentage. My point is only this, that you're talking about some kind of question: how much is enough? And then beyond that, how can I invest the rest of this in people by building truth into people? If you see the concept that I'm trying to describe, then you're looking then at a proportionality that would go up, and it would be the conviction between yourself and God. Give you a thought experiment. Consider whatever you're giving away right now, what percentage you're giving away right now. Consider bumping it up this year by 1% or 2%. Do that as an experiment, and then see how that works for you this year. See if God doesn't provide for you. Try doing that every year, and it gets very interesting indeed. So that when you bump it up on an annualized basis, you see what you're doing is you're taking more of a risk, but you're trusting in God who will provide for you. You see where I'm going with that? So that in my view then, when you're doing this in that manner, you're asking yourself, how much is enough? And if I've got this amount and enough, then everything 100% is given away beyond that. That's an interesting radical thought, isn't it? Now, if it went below that, okay, you'd still be giving according to the proportion you had, but it wouldn't be at 100%. I hope that makes some sense to you, though. But it's a very different approach that I don't see much that's being given, that I think is more consistent. But how then would a person give sacrificially? Proportionate is one thing, sacrificial is another. I don't know how to define that. Here's the way my closest definition: something that affects your lifestyle. Now, so then you have a scenario. If a person has assets of 1 million versus 5 versus 10, the question is, again, how well can you live and all those things. So you have to ask something that would have to affect your lifestyle. So it's a struggle to process. What questions do you have along these lines? With this idea, the question of proportionate, sacrificial, those two principles, and cheerful, that this is a privilege. Those are radical principles, yes. Yes.
Warren and I have attended a few times a small Baptist church in North Georgia, and they're very open about their finances. And if you give them anything, you get, their financial report. They have a basic monthly nut, and everything they receive over that amount they give away.
Mm-hmm. That's impressive. That's exactly, yeah.
How many churches do that?
That's the first one I've heard of. As far as I know, that's the first one. Yeah. Now so they're saying there's a ceiling. This is what we need, and then whatever beyond, we give it away. All I'm asking you to do is to prayerfully process this, because in the New Testament, it's not the tithe. You see, through the life of Jesus it was, but after that you won't find it, because that was part of the Old Testament law. Now it's more radical: proportionate, sacrificial, cheerful, and consistent. So it's more radical than that. Yes, you had a quote.
Yeah, Ken, this is kind of getting in the weeds, but how do you approach or whatever? Let's say that an asset goes up. Let's say your house goes up.
Yeah.
$1,000.
Uh-huh.
in a year, should you give away a percentage of that, or, I mean, that could be stocks, or that could be...
Yeah. I think that, then it comes down to working with some kind of a more, as you say, it's getting more in the weeds of that. But I'm talking about you have to decide the total resources that you have in terms of your net worth. Would probably be the best way of handling that. But I don't know. You have to pray about this. What is God telling me to do? Because am I in a position where I could give more? Is a question I have to raise. And then I have to say, how much do I need? And even if we're by beyond that, it's going to be something that could be then serving other people. But it's not to say that you're going to live, in a way that's completely menial. But on the other hand, it does mention sacrificial beyond their needs, their abilities. So it's. You have to process it. There's no mandate that tells me exactly how much it's going to be in this thing. We're not talking about according to His provision and to do it sacrificially. Those are just the concepts that I'm bringing up. Yes, Bunky.
I think another important principle here is the word says not under compulsion.
That's right.
So you can't. If you're giving out of guilt,
it's never good to give out of guilt. Yeah.
Because somebody forced you.
Yes, or manipulates you, or shames you, or any of those. There's so many methods that are used, I fear, that can be used under compulsion. But I think it should be under conviction.
How much do I give? Give what you want to. Mm-hmm. If you don't want to, then I don't think it's it's not valuable before God.
Yes. So it's the attitude of the heart. It's not the amount itself. But again, when we're talking about grace giving, and we're talking about grace giving, then the seed then that you are actually giving is something that God will multiply. So you're multiplying seed. So you have to just decide what that looks like. And it's interesting, some people have different convictions. Wesley, for example, didn't want to die with, I think, more than 10 pounds. Interesting notion that. So what he tried to do then was there was a lot of income coming in from his ministry. And he was extraordinary in that manner, so that he wanted to give a good account. Because the question we always have to ask is this question of what will Jesus ask me at the Bema? See, and so when you're thinking about the judgment seat of Christ, what kind of questions might He ask? Because we're dealing with matters of stewardship, aren't we?
How did you care for the poor?
How did you care for the poor? How did you invest in the lives of people who were in need, the people who were your neighbor, that sort of a thing? And also, so what did you do with the money I gave you? How did you invest that? How did you invest the time? How did you invest your abilities and your talent? And your relationships. Len.
What you're talking about is a very radical concept.
Yes, it is.
I experienced this firsthand. Years ago, I was introduced to a man named Troy Duhon, C-U-H-O-N, in New Orleans. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. When he was 15, he was washing cars at a Dodge dealership in New Orleans. And he saved his money so that he eventually bought a small percentage of the dealership. And then by the time he was 30, he actually owned the dealership. And he's a very sincere man and a strong believer. And he took this concept that Ken is talking about to the extreme and decided what was enough for him, and anything above that he was going to give away. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about car dealerships, but they can be very profitable. And so we're talking about a great deal of money that he was giving away as the owner of this Dodge dealership in New Orleans. But he promised that he was just going to give everything above that away. And so God blessed that. Today he owns 23 automobile dealerships. And he still lives in the same house he lived in when he was 30 years old. And the problem he's got, and this is what he told me in his own words, he said, I can't give it away fast enough. God keeps giving me more. He's founded orphanages, and he feeds something like 4,000 people a day, just free meals all over New Orleans, all over the world. And every time he thinks he's finally gotten to the point where he can spend all this money that God's given him, he gives him more. So it's a very radical thing.
Yeah, it is radical. Yes.
Phil Smith raised the idea of the giving of Boaz, how, in the story of Ruth,
Yes.
how giving he was,
Yes.
and thought that might be worthy of introducing.
Yeah, because and it relates as well with Boaz to the fields, and she was gleaning in those fields and the edges of those fields, which alludes right to that. That idea is always more radical than we might suppose. But at the end of the day, the guy knows he's building something that's going to endure. The other things are going to pass away, but the others. So I always have to ask myself then. What is going to happen? How am I investing my life in all those resources? And so, what am I? If it's all of God's, then I have to ask. Then I'll be going to be accountable for what I don't give away, not just what I give away, but what I don't give away, and what I hold on to. So, but the thing about it is, I ask you to launch a prayerful process in this matter, and. I would be glad to give you this manuscript that we're working on pretty soon, because it talks about the questions that we have to raise as well. How much, where, and all those questions as well, and the ways in doing that. So it's something I want to provide for you as well. So we're just processing that together. But I'm just saying, though, that for me, the concept is going to be developing an eternal perspective in this temporal arena and treasuring the things according to their true value. And so the wisest thing I can do then is to regard things according to what God says they are worth, and that's their true value. So the most foolish thing I can do then is to live in such a way that I'm going to have regrets at the judgment seat of Christ. I don't want to do that. He's going to. So, what did I do with my wealth, my time, my abilities, and all of those things? Did I squander it, or did I invest it? But at the end of the day, it will. Your time. You'll either squander or you'll invest. Maybe a combination, but you'll never get this day again. So it's all those things are so. Yeah.
We don't want to presume on the future because we may have a limited amount of time.
Yes.
In God's will.
Yes. And time is a huge thing. For me, I'm running out of time. It should be painfully obvious. As for man, it's 80 years and 10, if due to strength 80. But the fact is, already I'm living on borrowed time. I've had 17 near-death experiences, so it means that I'm basically borrowed time for unfinished business. And you don't know whether you have a year. Don't presume. Don't have the arrogance to think you're going to be here a year. That's a foolish thing to do. Live as this is your last year. Live as this is your last month, your last day. And then you're getting closer, in my mind, to a cutting-edge mindset that really will see the brevity of this earthbound condition and the eternity of the next. So most of our problems are mathematical. You see, we treat the temporal as if it's going to last forever, and we treat the eternal as if it's not worth much of anything at all. It's mathematical. You got it wrong. So, but it takes a measure of risk. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So it has to do with really transferring your desire from the seen to the unseen. And from the now to the not yet, and to believe his promises that this life is only a soul-forming world that's preparing us for home, And if you don't begin to cultivate an aspiration, an appetite for home, you need to begin to do that. And I'm been chewing on how we can cultivate and make it a desirable thing so we become more world weary and homesick.